Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thank you so much for being here with me today. Today, my guest on the podcast is Graham Wax. And if you're not familiar with Graham, Graham is a recording engineer, mixer, and producer out of Nashville, Tennessee. He also runs a company called City Acoustics, which is primarily what his focus is on these days. And that's where he designs and builds acoustic panels for home studios. And in this episode, we focus entirely on home studio acoustic treatment. And this is really important because when you're listening to your music, you want to make sure that you're listening to things accurately and that you're not falling victim to reflection points in your room and resonant frequencies and all that kind of stuff that can really skew the way you hear your music. By having a room that is well treated, you can hear your music accurately and confidently make decisions with your mixes so that you know what to boost, what to cut, and not be guessing whether it's the right move or not. So in this episode, we definitely get into a lot of topics about acoustic treatment as far as, what you need to do, how to do it yourself. We talk about a wide range of options from free options to options that definitely cost a lot more money, but will ultimately give you a much better treated room. So I think you're going to get so much great information from this. This is definitely a goldmine of an episode. So let's just jump right into the interview. Graham Wax, thank you so much for being on the MasterYourMix podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome, man. For people who might not know your background, how you got into all of this and how you got into music and acoustic treatment, can you give us that story?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been in Nashville for like 10, almost 11 years now. And before that, majored in music in Colorado, was in a bunch of bands, played drums, and toured. And once I got kind of settled into Nashville, started primarily recording, so mixing and engineering records, and had a couple different home studios here in town. And through building out both of those, got very into the acoustic side of things. Initially built just pretty straightforward acoustic panels for the first studio, and then the first iteration of the second studio, which was a like 3-tracking room, control room setup. So pretty solid home studio setup. Built those panels as well. Worked out of the space. Worked on all sorts of projects from major label things to independent records with local people here in town, and eventually started to realize sort of the shortcomings of the space on the acoustic side of things. And just got kind of down into that rabbit hole of figuring out how can I make things better and like really pinpointing like, oh, there's this one issue that's driving me nuts. How do I fix it? And then reading forums and books and trying just about everything you could think of, most of which didn't work out so well, and then trying other things and seeing what did work. And that kind of led to me making panels for other people, eventually building out a website, at which things kind of just started to snowball, and eventually building acoustic treatment sort of took over my life and got to the point where I was like, I can't make records and do this. And so a few years back, started focusing more on this, and now we've got a team of 6 people in a big shop up the road from here. And we do studio design and build products, ship them all over the country, and do all sorts of stuff.
That's amazing. I love that. So as far as learning this stuff, like you mentioned like books and forums and that kind of stuff, is that pretty much like the best way to learn this stuff? Or are there like better means of like, are there like schools for this? I guess maybe there are.
So the school, you can go to school for acoustics, but it's mostly like architectural acoustics.
Fair.
Or like mechanical engineering with a emphasis on acoustics. Like I just actually did a talk at Tennessee Tech with their mechanical engineer, a class in their mechanical engineering department. And the professor of that class is all about like vibration dampening. And so he does a lot of acoustics works, but his work's like, how do you make the motor in your car not super loud inside the car?
Gotcha.
And very much, not so much of like, how do you make this space sound good? So you can go to school for it, but if you can't really go to school for like home studio acoustics. You can go to school for like architectural acoustics, like churches, cathedrals, that kind of thing, but more of an emphasis on the architecture side. And there are, I think, a few master's programs more like on the technical side of acoustics. But yeah, for the most part, I think there are some really great books out there, and there's some forums online that are kind of hit or miss. It's one of those things where I think within acoustics, so much of what's out there has been kind of perpetuated from what can companies ship.
Fair.
And so you end up with a lot of products that are like way too small to effectively do what they're supposed to do. And a lot of things that are called bass traps or low end absorbers that like are just don't have the physical size to actually absorb any sort of low end. But if you want to ship a giant 80-pound thing, it's super expensive. And so people write about things that could kind of work and market them that way so they have something to sell. And so there's good and bad stuff online. I think I spent years sorting through a lot of like online forums and being like, you got to put stuff in the corners. And I put stuff in every corner of this room, and it still didn't fix a lot of the modal problems.
Gotcha.
So I think there are some great books, but they're pretty technical. Like the Master Handbooks of Acoustics is a great book on acoustics, but it's not going to like outline perfectly how to treat your home studio.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. Like from a lot of the stuff that I have seen, it tends to focus on like bigger projects and not the small home studio, which is definitely inaccurate.
Yeah, and a lot of it's just not like home studios aren't new by any means at this point. The technology to have a little portable interface that sounds great it's been around for a few years now, but like in terms of like people publishing books and really studying specifically how do you take the spare bedroom of your house and turn that into a studio is on the newer side. There's plenty of books on like how to design a concert hall.
Yeah.
And they're very technical, but there's just not a lot of like, here's your home studio, here's how you make this room sound great.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of like that, like the studio industry for years has always taught like you got to work in a big studio, and it like that's what being in a studio is.
Yeah.
So people have always focused on that, but like they've ignored the home studio market, which is definitely becoming way more popular. So
yeah, for sure. And I think like I didn't really like. It was a very long-winded way of not really giving you like a concrete answer. I think like we were talking about Yesko from Acoustic Insider. Like his website is a great resource for people. He's got awesome videos. Very practical approaches to home studio acoustics. I write a lot of articles really trying to break down like exactly what our approach is and like what does work and what doesn't work. So I think you're starting to see more of it, like people who are really focused on that market, like people like Yesko and I who didn't necessarily intend to be working on the acoustic side of things, but like we're making records and then got really passionate about acoustics and how to make it better and then trying to help, everybody else understand what will work and what won't work.
Yeah.
And so I think there's some pretty fundamental principles that I'm sure we'll talk about that like you just kind of carry those over. And that's really like when it comes to home studios, it's like you follow those things and you can very quickly make your room like as good as it possibly can be.
Absolutely. And for people who are listening to this who might not be sure of who Yesko is, Yesko was a previous guest on the podcast. So I can't remember the episode number offhand, but definitely go back through the list of episodes and you'll definitely see Yesko in there, and he's a great resource as well when it comes to all of this acoustic treatment stuff. So I guess it sounds pretty safe to say that based on everything you do, you totally believe that it's possible to make great recordings from a home studio.
Oh, for sure. I think you can make great recordings in a like completely untreated studio, and there's plenty of records that have been done so.
Amazing.
I think so it's not that like you have to. Acoustic treatment, I think, is incredibly important and is like really is if you're going to be working on records, probably one of the first things that you should be investing in because it will make your life easier and better. But you can do everything you want without it. It's just that it lets you focus on being creative and artistic and musical and not trying to correct for what you're hearing from your monitor. So if your brain is spending half of its energy trying to process what it's hearing because it knows at 130, 140 hertz, I have a big bump, and then I have a big null just below that. And if you're constantly thinking about that, and you're like, is this acoustic guitar boomy, or is it just my room that makes me think it's boomy? Then you're not really focusing all of your energy on how do things sound and how do they feel.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So it's not that you can't get to the same point, from a mix or tracking or a production. It's just that it's going to take you 10 times as long, and it's going to be 10 times as tiring. But
and
at
you
the
have
end
to
of the day,
learn your room.
Exactly. There's only so much you can really learn. So like it's hard to learn a completely untreated room. You're gonna have to learn your room in any room. But it really is just a matter of like how the better your room is, the better like version of yourself that you can be. Because at the end of the day, like you're still always gonna be you, and you're gonna make the kind of the choices that you make, and you're still gonna have the same taste, and that's why people will like working with you.
Mm-hmm. I think it's definitely about all of this stuff with your skills and the gear that you use and and all that. It all comes down to working efficiently. And so if you have a room that allows you to reduce the creative decisions that you have to make, or reduce just the number of decisions you have to make in general, if it's like correcting for bad room acoustics and all that kind of stuff, like that just makes your life easier. So like just knowing that,
sure.
okay, my room is controlled and now what I'm hearing is what I'm hearing and this is accurate, and it's like less decisions, and so you can actually focus on being more creative in the context of your mix and work more 100%.
Efficiently. It's all just like about how do you make that space, as like trustworthy as you can so that you can focus on being creative.
Absolutely. So is there anything that people can do to set up their rooms to sound better without even having treatment then?
Yeah, you can, from a placement standpoint, figuring out where you should be sitting, so the listening position and where your monitor should be, the relationship of those two things to one another, and then where they are in the rooms themselves, where they are within the room, will make a big difference. So there's not like any hard and fast rules. I'd say like the 38% rule is pretty common and a great starting point, but it's definitely just a starting point, which is, if people aren't familiar with it, it means that you should be sitting, like your listening position should be 38% of the room's length away from the front wall. So whatever wall you're looking at. And then from there, you want to create somewhat of an equilateral triangle with your monitors and the listening position. But that triangle should actually be like a foot behind your head, which makes this all a little bit more, makes this all a little bit more complicated for a podcast. But
yeah. So your face isn't the tip of the triangle. It's kind of just inside.
Exactly.
Of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost like the back of your head is kind of like the tip or something like that.
Even a little bit further behind. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's definitely good to know.
And real quick too, so like you take that like as a starting point and then move around a little bit, because as you move forward and backwards, like your listening position or your monitors, and both, the low end and how balanced it is going to change. And you want to be in the position where things are the most balanced.
Gotcha. And as far as that triangle goes, are you trying to line up your tweeters? Or are you trying to line up your woofers? What is the ideal reference point on your speakers?
Normally it's the tweeters.
Okay.
So different monitors can potentially be designed a little bit differently. And this comes into play more so vertically than it does. So like floor to ceiling height.
Mm-hmm.
So on most monitors, you want your tweeter to be at ear height or just above. Some monitors, like three-way designs, the acoustic axis of that monitor will actually be on the mid-range driver. But if you have the manual for your monitors, it will tell you in there. So like I have ATC 25s, and the axis of those is the mid-range driver. It's not the tweeter. And so
Gotcha.
Just when you're figuring out how high they should be, you want that mid-range driver like right at ear height when you're sitting at the listening position.
Gotcha. And does that change if you have monitors that are vertical versus horizontal?
Not really.
Okay.
It changes
change,
if the design of that speaker is different. So it's all about how the manufacturer or the speaker designer has their woofer, tweeter, and potentially mid-range driver time aligned. Because you want all of those to be arriving at the listening position at the exact same time. So vertical or horizontally oriented speakers, and a lot of speakers that can go either way, are still designed for the tweeter to be at ear height.
Gotcha.
But there's no it's all based off of how that speaker was designed. So if anybody's trying to figure it out, just like take a look at that manual, and it should be one of the first things in there.
Yeah, fair. Is there a certain distance that your speaker should always be from your walls?
Not a certain distance. So I'd say for most home studios, and like 95%, maybe more than that, I would put the speakers basically as close to the front wall as you possibly can, with a acoustic panel behind it. As you start to pull away from that, you're going to have cancellations off of the front wall. That will cause a lot of issues in your lows, low mids, depending on how far back you get. And the further away you go from the front wall, the lower in frequency those get and the harder they are to treat. So, and then your left or right walls, generally we just don't have a lot of options there. Like in terms of how far your speakers are from the left or the right walls, you want your listening position to be centered in your room, because having a symmetrical listening point or position is going to be incredibly important to making your stereo image accurate. So whatever's happening on the left side of the room, you want happening on the right side of the room. And then the distance from those walls is, I guess, normally you just wouldn't pick I wouldn't recommend picking the placement of your speakers based off of how far they're going to be from the left or the right wall. You
Gotcha.
kind of figure out like where your triangle is from front to back, more so than left to right. And it's just kind of a priority thing of what the impact of that is. The other issue that you can run into, and this is where that front wall, like having your speakers right up against your front wall, can be somewhat problematic, is it will very much so activate the front to back mode of your room. So like whatever the natural resonance of your room is, it will push that because your drivers are in like the optimal spot, the high pressure zone of your room for that frequency. And that means they'll work more efficiently. They don't have to work as hard to put out that energy, and they get loaded up there. So you will get more of that. You can either use like the low shelf setting on your monitors to combat that. A lot of speakers will have something like that. Or if you have the ability to EQ your monitors out at all, it's a very, very easy EQ change. And certain things are not, but just bringing down that additional amplitude there is. So that's normally not like, I would rather have to deal with that compromise than deal with those things that are canceling out, because there's no way to fix the cancellations other than treatment. And normally you don't have enough room to treat them.
Yeah, it's funny because I've always heard that like in smaller rooms, or maybe in general, I've always heard that like having your monitors up against the wall would cause more bass response problems, because then you're getting more reflection off the back wall and it's amplifying all that stuff. But I guess maybe that's where you're saying you can use that filter to...
Yes, it's very, like, that's super common, right? You'll read that, like, that's in most speaker manufacturers' instructions. And it's not that that doesn't happen, it's just that it's really easy to deal with. Particularly now, as like, if people are using an Apollo, you can EQ the output of the Apollo. And like everything you listen to through Spotify or whatever your streaming platform is, plus, you know, Pro Tools, Logic, everything goes out of that. So you always have a consistent reference, which is super important. But you can't EQ out those cancellations that you have off your front wall. And you're going to have them off your back wall either way unless you're treating it. So the only thing that it's really changing is how much you're loading up that low mode, or the front to back axial mode that's in the room. And you're going to have that mode either way. So it's not like you're not alleviating anything. You're not like eliminating any other problems by putting your speakers further out into the room. You're just sort of creating additional ones.
Gotcha. Interesting. And I guess that would also be a little bit more exaggerated depending on the listening volume that you have, right?
Not really. So like modes will be impactful at any volume. We're not as sensitive to low end at lower volumes. So if you monitor really quietly, we don't perceive it as well. And that's just loudness curves, like how we actually hear. But it's not that it's not happening.
Gotcha.
The one thing that you can do in an untreated room, kind of going back to like how could you hear things more accurately, is the closer you get to your speakers, the better in that case. Because you have more of the direct sound from the speaker and less of your reflected sound.
Gotcha.
Or at least, just in being such close proximity to that. So you'll get a much cleaner, reference point from your speakers that way, because the reflected sound will be arriving considerably later than the direct sound at that point. But yeah, the effects of modes and low frequency issues at any volume are going to be there. We just may not be as sensitive to it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially the idea of being closer to your monitors. I definitely feel like anytime I've gone into a big room that has the mains on the walls, like I always feel like it's such a hard adjustment for me, because I'm just so used to like working in a smaller room and having everything close to my ears, and I feel way more comfortable in that environment than like something bigger that has, whatever, like top of line acoustics and top of line speakers and whatever. Like totally. I always feel like it's such an adjustment for me that I just know my room so well that it's like I'm comfortable here, right?
Right. Yeah.
But that makes a lot of sense with the way you framed it. So then when it comes to, like, I always hear about, like, the Fletcher-Munson curves and, listening at, like, 84 dB or whatever. Does that still very much apply in home studios? Like, should we be, like, measuring our normal listening levels to see, like, we should always be listening at a certain level?
I would say, yeah, if you could, this is a somewhat hard thing to do, but a very good practice to have. Particularly if you're mixing, it's almost impossible to do this as a tracking engineer, or if you're producing because you have other people in the room and they're gonna be like, turn it up. But yeah, if you're mixing and you can get in the habit of having one set level that you mix at all the time, and that's your main reference, it is an incredible practice to have. It's definitely a challenge. it's not something I was ever like great at. I had basically like 3 positions on my monitor controller that I would always use. And when you do that, it just makes it easier to learn your room because you're learning the room at specific, levels, as opposed to trying to always interpret what you're hearing at these various, at different levels or volumes. So it makes knowing what you're hearing much easier. Does it matter so much that you do it at 84 dB versus, I would say 84 is pretty loud to be working all day personally. There's plenty of people who do it.
Every time I've tried to measure it here, I always feel like it's way too loud in my room.
I normally worked, when I was still working on records, I worked pretty quietly, particularly if I was mixing. But whatever it's more so just pick a level and try to stick to that as much as possible, because that way you know what you're hearing at that point. And you could very quickly, learn that like at 65 dB, you're going to perceive less low end than you would at 85. And that's just how our ears work.
Gotcha.
But it's all a matter of like, in the same way that you learn what your room is, it's all just a matter of like, what is your internal reference?
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a good point. Because if you have that same level all the time, like, that like when you take it out to your car or whatever, you're missing that low end or whatever, right? So you have to you're always compensating to some degree, but you're creating that regular environment where like you just know the things you have to do to make it work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I love that. That's really good point. And I definitely think that people should be like, I always listen at the same volume. It's basically I've marked off like where on my monitor controller my level goes to, and that's my starting point for everything. And then and then, I might crank it up a little bit here and there just to see if I'm hearing anything when I adjust to different volumes. But for the most part, like 95% of my mix is done at one level.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about monitor selection as well? Like I've heard people say that you shouldn't have certain monitors in smaller rooms because maybe they're too big and they're producing too loud or too big of a sound for a room. Do you believe in that?
No.
Okay.
Is the short answer. I think the biggest issue with monitors is actually the form factor of them. So like, do they physically fit in your room and give you enough space to accurately position them? And so with like bigger boxes, 3-way speakers, as you start to, if you take a home studio and you start to treat it well and you actually like have bass traps that are spaced off of the wall, the rooms very quickly become smaller. And then if you take a big speaker and you put it in there, you can very easily get to the place where like you can't necessarily put that speaker right where you would want it to have it placed optimally. So that is a concern. But the speaker actually putting out too much low end is kind of a confusing thing. And I think the easiest way I would look at it is like, we want a balanced reference. And speakers are designed, no matter how big they are, to be relatively flat. So you can take a giant 4-way speaker, and if you look at the frequency response of that speaker, it's still probably going to be like plus or minus 3 dB if it's a good speaker from 20 hertz, if it's a great speaker from 20 hertz all the way to 20,000 hertz. If it's a much smaller speaker, let's say maybe you go from 40 hertz all the way to 20,000 hertz, but still in that plus or minus 3 dB range. And then at that point, the only way you're getting more low end out of the bigger speaker, other than those last 20 hertz, is if you turn it up louder. Right? But at a low volume, that speaker's not putting out more low end. It just has more headroom, so you can turn it up louder, and it can produce low end more accurately and cleanly. So I think the size of the speaker needing to match the room, in my opinion, is a much more physical aspect than it is like how much low end is actually coming out of that speaker.
That makes sense, yeah.
Because the low end's based off, like how much low end's coming out is based off of the volume you have it at.
True. Yeah, it's not like it's just like all sub at a certain volume or something
exactly.
like that. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And one other thing before we start talking about like actually applying treatment to walls, I'm curious to know, like, does it matter whether your speakers are positioned along the short wall or the long wall?
It definitely can and normally does. I would say like 90% of the rooms that I work on or design, we normally have oriented on the long wall to get that longer throw. So the speakers, your speakers the woofers are aimed down the longest direction of that room.
Yeah.
And that just gives them a longer throw. It also normally just works out kind of layout wise with most spaces better. When you get into rooms that have pretty similar layouts, and particularly home studios where like we don't get to pick where the doors and the windows are, some of those things can change. And those issues can become more important than the length of the room, particularly if they're, within a few feet, because you're not going to have a huge change there. And I'd rather have the layout of the room work so that, one, it's a comfortable space to work in, and two, it is also can be treated well. So there's some factors that come into play there, certainly, but yeah, more often than not, I'd say go the long way of the room.
Makes sense. And then when it comes to like, for people who are ready to start applying treatment to the room, like where does someone start? Like, do you just listen to music and kind of guess what you need to like take care of? Do you clap? Do you start measuring? Do you do math? Like where does someone start to get into this?
For most home studios, if you're, not spending or investing over probably $10,000 or so, you're kind of just going to have all of like the main things that you should do, right? So like treat your early reflections. And in a home studio, there's not a lot of like early and late reflections because the room's pretty small. So everything's coming in very fast. And we perceive that all pretty much as one sound source, which is why it's so important to treat it so you can hear more of the direct sound from your speakers.
And for people who might not know early reflections, what do you mean by that?
So early reflections are like view of your speaker setup, the first reflections that arrive at the listening position. So you have the direct sound basically coming straight out of your speaker to the listening position. And then you're going to have some sound that goes out of your speaker, hits the left or the right wall, and then bounces back to the listening position. And the same thing can happen off the floor, off the ceiling, off of your front wall, and off your back wall. And so they're all just reflections off of the walls or floor, ceiling, the boundaries of the room that arrive back at the listening position. And the issue with that is that they're arriving at a different point in time then. So they're delayed because they've taken a longer path to the listening position. And that's what causes, really major dips. So you have like speaker boundary interference, which is just a fancy word for reflections off of your walls, basically. But that's how you can get things that look like comb filtering. If you're looking at measurements, you can get really sharp dips in your frequency response at low frequencies in particular. And that's all just issues with reflections in the room. So by treating it, you can start to smooth that out quite a bit and make the room feel and sound a lot more balanced. So from a starting point, I'd say the main areas I would look are the side walls, your early reflections off the left and the right walls, the cloud. So like particularly in home studios, I've found that putting a cloud up is incredibly important, and the back wall and the front wall. So basically, at this point we're like at most of the whole room, but like really as much of the wall space as you can. The front walls are going to be really important, kind of like we were talking about earlier, of getting your speakers as close to the wall as you can, but with a panel behind it, to help mitigate those issues with the reflections off of that wall. The cloud is incredibly important, not just for your stereo imaging in depth, but for the low end. So most home studios even most commercial studios really have pretty low ceilings. So I'd say, and certainly in the US, the most common is an 8-foot ceiling. And that means that your head is right at the middle of the room from the floor to ceiling measurement. And that means that the axial mode from the floor to ceiling, the second octave of it has a massive boost right at 4 feet. And your speakers are at 4 feet off the ground and your head's at 4 feet off the ground. And so is that boost. And that means you will have a massive peak at like 140 hertz if you have an 8-foot ceiling. If you have a 9-foot ceiling, it's like 130 or a little bit lower. It's a very easy thing to treat if you just put a big cloud up above you and make sure that it's deep enough to actually treat 130, 140 hertz. And then you can kind of get into all those same things. So like, how do you deal with as low of a frequency as possible in all of those places? And so the back wall in most rooms is going to be super important for low end because your speakers are pointed right at it. And so you're going to have those same axial modes going front to back. And axial modes are any mode that just it's a mode between two surfaces. So it's like the front wall to the back wall, or the left wall to the right wall, or the floor to the ceiling.
And also, a mode is a resonance, or like...
Yeah. So a room mode they are the frequencies at which the room will like resonate, essentially. So you take... It's just because the length of the room correlates to that frequency's wavelength. So it fits basically perfectly within the length or the width or the height of your room. and therefore that waveform can just go back and forth, and it fits in the room perfectly, and so the room is resonating with it or increasing the amplitude of it.
Gotcha.
And so axial modes are the ones that just involve two surfaces, and they're the most powerful. So they're the most problematic because they're the ones that cause the biggest increase in amplitude or the biggest null. You have tangential and oblique modes, and those just involve more surfaces. So can still be somewhat problematic, but have way less energy. So they're a little bit easier to deal with and to treat, and they don't cause as many problems. And so one resource that is online, if people want to check out and see what's going on in their room, is the room mode calculator by Amrock. It's a free, very easy to use website. You just type in your room dimensions. It will show you all of the modes that you have. It breaks out the Benello, which shows per 1/3 octave range how many modes you have and whether or not that's it's a good ratio essentially, which is very cool. So you can really see how things break out and use that to figure out, kind of what you were saying earlier, how can you figure out where to treat things? So all of those surfaces to treat are super important, but if you really want to know where your biggest low frequency issues are, looking at something like that can be very useful.
Yeah. And so then once you've used something like this tool here and you've got an idea of, kind of the modes and all the issues, how do you decide where to put your panels? I've heard of the mirror trick where people will slide a mirror along the wall. Is that an accurate way to do it? That will tell you where the early reflections come from. So the mirror trick, kind of to break that down, is you sit in the listening position of your room and you have somebody walk down, let's say the left side of your room, and they're holding a mirror up against the wall. And at the point in which you can see the speaker, that's going to be the first reflection. And then you just repeat that process, and that's where you're going to want a panel. And then you repeat. And one thing I've never actually seen anyone explain with this mirror trick is when someone is sliding the mirror along the walls, are you moving your position to follow the mirror, or are you
you just pivot your head?
Okay, because I was going to say you're normally facing a different direction than where the mirror is.
You
right?
stay seated. You can turn your head a little bit. You won't have to look that far. It's a useful trick. It's not in most cases going to be life-changing. It's not hard to look at the wall and figure out basically where's the speaker, where do you sit? Somewhere in between those two things is going to be the point of the early reflections.
Yeah.
The back wall is a little bit different in that your speakers are angled because they're towed in normally to, create the triangle with your head. And so where they are, your right speaker is actually going to hit the left side of the back wall. And then the left speaker will actually hit the right side of the back wall. And where that becomes really noticeable is in cancellations off of your back wall. So if you're looking at measurements of your room, and you'll see in this room that I'm in, this used to be the control room in my studio, there's a door on the back wall and it's on the right side of the room. So the left speaker has a pretty significant null or cancellation at 70 hertz, and the right wall doesn't have it at all, or the right speaker does not have it at all because that back wall is treated with a 1.5 foot deep bass trap. Mm-mm. And it's just one issue with sound hitting a door and one issue with sound hitting a bass trap that works much better. So it's a good trick for that because your panels, sorry, that was a very long way to say, the panels on the back wall, the most important place to treat that wall is actually where your panels are hitting it, where they're aimed. So just treating the middle of the back wall isn't going to be that effective. But treating the back wall where your panels are aimed and hitting the wall is going to be very effective.
It's almost like if you were to draw just a straight line from your speaker to the back wall, that's the spot that you want to hit.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I've always heard people talk about the mirror trick, and I've certainly done it for myself, but I did notice a significant difference when I applied it, and I think it's just such an easy little hack for people to figure out where to put things. Because you always see pictures of people just plastering their walls and stuff, or nobody knows where to put things. So it's obviously really important to know that.
If people are curious how to apply this to their room, and my answers are probably way too long-winded and hard to follow, we do have an article on our website that I wrote called "What Acoustic Treatment Do I Need?" and it breaks down exactly how I would treat home studios. There's 2 different sizes. They each go through several different price points, and then it breaks down our process too. So even if the price point, if you can follow those, and it goes from like $500 all the way up to $10,000, but it is all based around sort of like 4 principles of acoustics, and then 4 questions about like the individual user and how are they using that space and what are they doing within it. And so it breaks each of those down to where they can answer those questions and then apply it to their space, and from there really figure out with the different examples like how to treat their space, which walls to start with, and which panels are, best case scenario as you get higher in budget, like the bigger the panels, and by bigger I mean deeper, the better, because they'll treat more low end. And so that's a really cool resource because it just like breaks down basically exactly what I would design for somebody.
Amazing. Now we've talked about panels a little bit, but what panel should people be looking for? Like, I always see people talk about, like, there's a lot of mixed information about like studio foam works or egg crates, and then there's obviously like stuff that looks significantly nicer and better. What is the best place that people should be looking for? Like, what are the right types of panels to get?
Totally. I wouldn't get egg crates. It's funny you brought it up because I just had this conversation. We got one of the guys who works with us. He's finishing up college this year, and he had a professor, and he's been like doing a bunch of research online, I guess. And he asked me about egg crates, and he's like, somebody told me that they work really well, and I've seen it online a few times. And if you just look at sort of like the physics behind these things, like, for the most part, mass and depth are the two main and airflow resistivity. So how hard is it for air to travel through a certain type of material? Those are the 3 things that determine how well something, or at least any porous absorber, so like a normal panel, studio foam, potentially egg crates would work. I actually found the NRC ratings for egg crates, and they don't do anything. So don't put egg crates in your studio. And NRC ratings are
fire hazard too, right?
Yeah. That's a noise reduction coefficient. So it's just like, how well does something absorb sound? They don't work. Not surprising, but very definitive. There's a chart on it, I think, in the Master Handbook of Acoustics, if anybody's curious. But yeah, so different products. So kind of what I was saying, porous absorbers or velocity absorbers are anything that is trying to slow down or make it harder for those air particles to move through it. So that's like your normal acoustic panel. If you're looking at like foam type products, that's all how they all work that way. How effective they are primarily comes down to how deep they are, because the deeper the panel is, the more effective it will be at lower frequencies. The other main factor that will come into play there is where you put them in your room. And the reason a lot of people have probably heard that you should space them off the wall or have an air gap is that air particles within your room move very slowly right up against the boundaries. And that's why if you're walking around a room and you start to hear more low end right when you get like up against the wall or to the back wall, is because pressure is increasing there. So you have increased sound pressure, but decreased velocity. And it's just a matter of like, if you think about like driving a car into a wall or running into a wall, that car could be going 70 miles an hour right up until the point where it hits the wall. And then it's very quickly going 0 miles an hour and it's crumpled up on top of itself. So all of a sudden you have this huge increase in pressure, but a complete loss of speed. And sound works the exact same way. So if you put a panel that is trying to work off of how quickly those particles are moving up against each other, and you put it in the spot where they're not moving, it can't do anything. If you push it off the wall with that air gap to where those air particles are moving, then it can be a very effective absorber. And so you can really effectively absorb, quite a bit of low end all the way down to 40, 50 hertz with a 6-inch deep panel if it's got 6 inches of air behind it. Foam products are a little bit lighter. They generally don't work as well. It's in large part because of how they're made, because of the shape of them. So most foam panels have half of the panel cut out to make the wedges.
True.
So you have
it's that egg
part of
design.
that panel that's 2 inches deep, but it's also the tip of the triangle. And then you have a big chunk of that panel that's 1/4 of an inch deep and can't do anything. So if you made those deep enough, they could potentially do something. There's also a lot of triangular corner products that are made. There's a couple of issues there. One, triangle, like tri-corner products. go all the way into the corner. So you have that issue again of not having any air particle movement. There's no velocity there. So they'll be helpful, but certainly not the most effective way to treat a corner. And if you have them, a lot of those foam ones are just way too small. So if they have they'll only be 12 inches deep. So they're 17 inches across and 12 inches deep on each side. And so they're barely coming out of the corner. And it's just way too small to absorb a lot of low end. If you are really tight on space, it's like if you're making a vocal booth or something and an issue, where you don't have a lot of 100 hertz and lower and that kind of thing to consider, a tri-corner trap can work really well because it doesn't take up a lot of space in the room and it will effectively absorb down to 100 hertz or so. It just isn't very effective below that because of its placement. You're much better off just taking a regular acoustic panel that's 6 inches deep, so like a bass trap panel, that kind of thing, and straddling the corner with it because it sticks out further in the room. And so at the center of that panel, you've got a 12-inch deep air gap. And now all of a sudden you have a panel that's very capable of absorbing all the way down to 40 hertz.
Gotcha. Now, do you always recommend having that air gap, or does that depend on the room modes that you have and how much low end buildup you've got in your room? Because if it is off the wall, it sounds like you're saying it will reduce the low end, but how much low end are we actually always trying to reduce?
As much as you can.
Okay.
Every room has, so particularly home studios, any small room has really more than you can absorb. We don't have enough space to you can't overdo it. So you're not you're trying to even things out. So that doesn't mean you can, in the way that you can over treat your high and mid frequencies. So you can have a room that sounds too dead. You really can't do that with low end. And maybe in a large enough room you can, but the issue that you have with treating, absorbing too much high and low frequencies is much more of a balancing issue. And this you will see in big rooms. So if you take a big auditorium or a venue or a church, and they have 30-foot tall drywall walls and ceilings, so there's drywall everywhere. Drywall is a very effective low frequency absorber at certain frequencies because it will act like a membrane. So you can have these huge rooms that have they'll just be completely missing 100 hertz or 125 hertz and then really long reverb times in the high and mid frequencies. And so they're imbalanced in a very different way from what we normally see in small spaces. In small spaces, one, because of the limitation of the room to begin with, but two, because you still have to be able to work in it, you're never going to over-treat the low end. You're just going to make it sound more and more balanced and then get it as good as you possibly can. There's a lot of, if you look at older studios when they were still building out big commercial facilities, they'd have 6 inches, at least 6 feet of bass trapping all the way around the room and on the ceiling. So you would never see it because it's all fabric lined walls.
Yeah, they just look like walls.
But yeah, so in a home studio, you're not going to overdo it. It's just going to get better and better.
Yeah, and if you try to do those really deep walls, you're going to have no space in your room.
Exactly. Yeah. So you'd end up with a 2 foot by 4 foot room, and then you can kind of
perfect acoustic treatments.
crawl in there to work in it.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm looking at your room right now, and you said that you had 1.5 feet of bass trap behind those walls. You would never know.
No, because I framed this room. We framed out. So this whole room I did as kind of a research project because we started this pretty much after I had stopped working on records. But this room and then what used to be the piano and keys room, we treated and did a bunch of research in 2 different ways. So this room was framed out so we could put in different depths of insulation and absorption products and try out, what happens if you put in these front corners, they're 3 feet deep. So at the deepest part of them. And so it was what happens if you put 3 feet of rock wool in there? Or what happens if you put a foot of rock wool with fluffy insulation behind it or only fluffy insulation? So this room was kind of an experiment and research project into, one, what effect did the air gaps have? Because we could push stuff all the way up against the wall or we could pull it out. We could try different combinations of materials like I mentioned. And then I really wanted to see how far could you take kind of a home studio within a at least reasonable setup without tearing the walls out and building building everything from scratch. And then the other room we did with all prefabricated panels. So that one wasn't so much so of like how do you test different products and materials, but more so of like what can you accomplish if everything is a prefabricated like 4x2 foot panel placed in the most optimal way possible. Ironically, I think the other room, which is smaller and wasn't, completely framed out, sounded better, which I was not expecting.
But yeah, every room's going to sound different. That's kind of the nature of the beast, right? Yeah. Now, speaking of rooms, does it matter the shape of your room? Like, is it better to have a rectangular room, a square room, any of that?
It's definitely not great to have a square room. Just because if you have a room that's 10 by 10 feet, you're going to have those modes from your like front to back and left to right. Modes will compound. You always want to avoid having modes like stacked on top of each other. So if somebody's, if anybody's listening and has like a room that has, whatever the dimensions are, if they just like type it into that room mode calculator, AMROC, it will show you the distribution of the modes. It just shows up as like these straight lines, and you want those lines to be as evenly spaced as possible. So anytime you have two lines that are like right next to each other, it's just a graph. So like of the frequency spectrum. So you'd like to avoid having one mode at like 95 hertz and one at 94 hertz because they'll start to activate each other. And so the room will start to resonate, and then it just lasts longer and makes things more inconsistent. So if you could have one at 75, 85, 95, 105, that's going to be much better than having 95, 94, 92, 90,
Gotcha.
That kind of thing. And so when you have a different length and width, you get a better distribution of your modes. Taking that a little bit further, so like rectangular, definitely better than square. Beyond that, it's not so much necessarily like a good or a bad thing. It's a much harder to predict thing. So like rectangular rooms, there's a lot of really good, easy math out there. There's a lot of calculators for like room modes, that kind of thing, that can be very useful resources. As soon as you start introducing different shapes, pitched ceilings, an L-shaped room, anything like that, it's much harder to do the math to calculate what's going on in those spaces. So then you just have to listen more, which is not a bad thing. I mean, ultimately, it's like you can listen more, you can take measurements if you're comfortable, working with Room EQ Wizard or anything like that, so you can see what's going on and then adjust from there.
Mm-hmm. It seems like when you look at a lot of bigger studios, it always kind of has like almost like a hexagon type of shape. But I'm sure a lot of that has to do with the actual treatment positioning. Like the room itself is probably
it's a lot of treatment positioning and a lot of high and mid frequency issues. It's not, I think it's pretty commonly thought of to be a low frequency factor, and to truly like create a better low frequency situation with angling your walls, you have to have a massive angle or a massive length of wall. So for the most part, what it does is it changes what you need to do on a high and mid frequency level, that kind of thing, as opposed to like how well does the low end sound, or can you eliminate room modes? And you can't, you still have them, you just won't be able to do the math to figure out what they are. They can potentially have a little bit less energy, which is certainly helpful, but for the most part, it just means like your high mid frequencies, or your highs and your mid frequencies, are going to be reflecting in a different way.
Yeah.
Which is a good thing. So it's not like it's not at all a bad thing, but most, if I'm designing a room from the ground up, would I do it? Maybe. If I'm working on a home studio, then it's like, okay, great. What are the walls looking like? And how do we make it as great as it can be?
Yeah. But in like a home studio space where it's maybe a smaller room, like you don't making that like a hexagonal shape kind of with angled walls, like that's not really going to help you too much. It's probably going to work against you in a small room.
Yeah, it's definitely not worth it to be like to build out a new wall to display it a little bit.
Fair. Yeah. We get some guys that listen to this who will probably be like building their studio and seeing like all these other big studios out there and thinking like, oh, I should just angle my walls like this, and then but it's not
for sure.
Be that case.
It's not something I would say go out of your way to do. If it's an option within like the building phase, it's a decent thing to consider. Not necessarily the best option,
but only if you have the size for it.
Yeah, but no, if you're working within an existing room, like in no way should you feel like, one, you need to, and two, it will be that helpful.
Gotcha. So then when it comes to the different types of panels that you can get, I always see things about absorption or diffusion or bass traps. Like those are the common products out there. When do you need absorption versus bass traps versus diffusion?
Yeah. So I think bass traps as a whole is somewhat of a confusing term because it's just there's no like set, this is a bass trap, right? It's more so of like, here is a product that is at least hopefully and not always capable of absorbing low-end frequencies or low-end energy. It doesn't necessarily mean it's drastically different from a panel that's like designed to absorb high frequencies or mid frequencies. That kind of goes back to what we were talking about of like depth is the main thing that determines how low in frequency will a panel work. So the deeper the panel, the lower the frequencies it will be capable of absorbing. So like we make panels that are have from 1 to 4 and 6 inches mineral wool in them. And those are kind of the standard things. Then we also do like much deeper custom built out things as well. But those are the primary things that like prefabricated panels that we have. The 6-inch deep one, like our bass trap panel, is a very effective low frequency absorber, particularly when paired with that airspace like we were talking about. So that is the panel that in most places, like if you have the room and the space for it, I would put in a home studio. Obviously, that can start to take up a lot of space. So then we'll kind of work in combinations of like bass trap panels and broadband panels so that you can still have a very comfortable space with a great vibe and still absorb, the low end energy that you need to so your room doesn't sound muddy and boxy and have a lack of balance. But for the most part, in smaller rooms, the deeper the panels, the better. I would almost never tell somebody to put a high mid panel in a like control room. Tracking rooms, there's applications and settings where that makes more sense. But like if you're mixing or producing or mastering in a room, you want panels that are capable of absorbing, as low as possible. And you want that everywhere.
And when you talk about the depth, you're talking about the actual depth of the material inside of the panel. Because yes, a lot of these panels do have some air gap stuff built into them as well, right?
A little bit. Yeah. There aren't any panels where, so like ideal air gap for most panels, you want the thickness or the depth of the insulation material to match the air gap.
Gotcha.
And so I don't think there's anything out there where there's like a 6-inch, 8-inch deep panel with a 6 or an 8-inch air gap. And I don't think there should be, because it's like then you have people paying for a lot of materials to make an air gap and a lot of cost to ship that, and it's just space where so you can install it, with an air gap.
So the panel can actually be. So the panel in this case would actually be like with the air gap. You're talking about like usually that's built into the. Usually, like I said, it's kind of built somewhat in the panel or just like hanging off the wall a little bit. But as far as like that depth, like you're saying like extend that panel out as far as possible from the wall, kind of.
Yeah, I would say match it to the depth of the panel itself.
Gotcha.
So you have a 6-inch deep panel, match the air depth or the air gap to that. So then mount it 6 inches off the wall. And then total depth is a foot. If it's a 4-inch deep panel, mount it 4 inches off the wall. So you have an 8-inch depth then. Mm-hmm. And that will prevent it. If you go too far, it will start to decrease its efficiency and its capability of absorbing frequencies higher up, just as it relates to their waveform and where they have peaks and nulls in their velocity. The one exception to that is corners. So if you're treating your corners, the air gap that you have can be much larger, and in that case, it can be a good thing because you're taking advantage of how low in frequency you can start to absorb. And at that point, you're really targeting low end, and you're not treating that corner so much for the mid and high functionality of that panel. And so at that point, you're like, how do I absorb 40, 30, 50, 60 hertz, those really low frequencies? Taking a 4-foot panel or 4-foot panels and putting them in your corners if you have the space to where they're 4 feet wide and like 2 feet tall, and you stack them up. Now you've got a 2 to like 3 foot gap, something in there from the peak of that or the center of that corner to the front of that panel. So you have a panel that's really far removed from the walls and the boundaries in your room. So you have a panel that's very capable of absorbing really low frequencies. And that's what you're targeting right there. So in that setting, it's a great option. But for panels on the front, for panels on the side walls, the front walls, I probably wouldn't do the air gap because you want your speakers as close to the wall as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So normally we skip it there. But back wall, side walls, definitely on the ceiling. Those are the regions or the areas where you want the air gaps.
That's an interesting point that you brought up about having the wall with the speakers not having that gap on there, because I think people would just naturally assume you have the gap everywhere, right?
Right. Yeah, there I really want in most cases I want the speaker as close to that wall as possible.
Gotcha. And is it kind of advised to always treat your corners? Is there a situation where you might not want to? If you can.
Okay. There's not a situation where you don't want to. It's not the thing that I would do first. So like when we were talking about like where to treat when we were talking about like treating the early reflections in your side walls and the ceiling and the front walls and the back wall, I didn't include the corners in there because I wouldn't start with them in almost any space. And that's because kind of what we've been talking about, like axial modes, these modes that are, between two walls. Yes, all modes have more terminate in the corners and have more energy there. And so it has become very common practice and very commonly talked about on the internet to treat your corners. And it's the place where, everybody's like, it's the spot that you have to treat and put tri-corner traps in there, right? And like fill all those spaces and your low end will be even. And all of that energy from your axial modes is centered between these two walls or the floor to the ceiling. So like the cloud, which will, essentially eliminate your entire boominess at like 140 hertz, like we were talking about before, if you've got an 8-foot ceiling, if you treat your corners all floor to ceiling, all soffit corners, so like your wall ceiling corners, you're still going to have that because that energy is just traveling between the floor and the ceiling and there's nothing there to break it up. And your corners aren't affecting that. So I don't typically start with them. If it's a room where somebody's got the budget or they're doing it in stages, it's definitely a latter stage for me. Where it is super helpful is the decay time of the room. So when you're trying to get the low frequency decay time lower, which is important, is just a little bit further down the list of things that I would say you should address first.
Yeah. So then where does diffusion come into play?
In small studios?
Yeah.
Hopefully not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. So I say that somewhat jokingly, but somewhat truthfully as well. So like I say not at all as in scattering, which isn't like, if you like technically diffusion, just because there's like a set of criteria that something has to meet to be a true diffuser. But so scattering, so like wood slats or something on top of panels is incredibly effective and really needed in a lot of spaces. I say diffusion shouldn't come into play because most smaller rooms and home studios don't have the space for it. So for a diffuser to work really well, you need to be like at least 6 feet away from it. So that by the time that those reflections arrive to you at the listening position, there's actually the diffused sound field. Otherwise, you're not really hearing the effect of it. So in a lot of rooms, people aren't that far away from their back wall, which is where you'd most commonly see a diffuser, like in a control room setting. And in most spaces, they're definitely not that far away from their left or right walls. The other issue, and probably more importantly, is that diffusers, unless they are very deep, do not diffuse low frequencies. And as we've been talking about, like low frequencies cause all sorts of problems in studios. And so we really need that space, particularly like on the back wall, to be effectively absorbing low end and addressing those modes, but also just low end reflections off of that back wall. So you don't have the speaker boundary interference reflections that cause those big dips. And if you start putting diffusion on that back wall, you're now only really treating frequencies that are like 800 hertz or so and higher. You can make a diffuser work lower, but most products available aren't deep enough to do so. So it's just sort of a matter of like what's most important and what do you have space for? And most rooms don't have truly enough space for the diffusers, and they certainly don't have enough space for bass traps on that back wall with the diffuser on top of it.
Fair.
And that would be effective, and that's how like big commercial studios are designed. So if you see diffusers on the back wall, there's a ton of bass trapping behind them. So it's not like diffusion's the only thing there. It's just the thing that you can see.
Interesting.
And so scattering, so like we have a product called a scatter face, and it actually is a separate product but can go on top of any of the panels. And it's just designed to scatter high and mid frequencies, so you can put it on top of a bass trap panel or on top of a broadband panel. And instead of that panel absorbing all of the energy that hits it at those frequencies, it will scatter it. So it'll break them up. It reduces any specular reflections, which are just reflections that travel like an array-like manner. And those are the ones that cause a lot of problems. So that's really kind of the best option in a smaller space. So you have absorption and scattering combined.
So what really is the advantage of diffusion then? Because if it's scattering these frequencies and we're talking about reflection points and all this stuff, like why would we want to reflect these things?
Because it retains energy, and there's oftentimes where that can be a good thing. So like, let's take, for reference, in a control room, in a small like home studio or even a small commercial studio, you want a decay time for that room around 200 milliseconds. Your live room, you might want closer to like 750 milliseconds, depending on the size of it. If it's a little bit smaller, 500 milliseconds, but like something much higher. Or listening rooms, where those rooms are more about enjoyment and less so about accuracy. So they want to retain more of the reflections in the life and things. In those settings, it's better to diffuse because you can keep that space live without it having a bunch of flutter echo, without it being too focused at certain frequencies and things start to sound really harsh. So in that setting, it's great. The reason that like scatter faces or any type of product that can work in conjunction with absorption and go on top of it is important in control rooms is that rooms that are too dry sounding are hard to work in because your ear needs reflections. So you do want something reflecting, you just don't want it to prevent you from doing other things that will allow you to treat the low end effectively. So if you spend all day in a room that just has absorption everywhere, your ears are going to be super fatigued at the end of the day because your brain's constantly trying to figure out where it is. It's why people can't spend more than like 20 minutes in an anechoic chamber.
I was just thinking about that.
There's no reflections in there, and it like will drive your brain nuts. It's like it has no spatial awareness at that point. And like we like to know where we are, and we use reflections off of surfaces to figure that out.
Gotcha.
So you need some kind of reflection, but yeah, diffusion is very effective in like live rooms, in concert halls. It's used extensively in spaces where like you're trying to control reflections but not absorb the energy.
But I mean, it sounds like based off everything you said, I've always heard of the concept of having like a live end and a dead end in a room, and having like kind of the reflective side at the back. That really only applies to the bigger spaces. And like you said, if you don't have 6 feet with from your ears to where a diffuser would be, then it's kind of no point, right?
Exactly.
Gotcha.
And those designs, if they were done well, still had bass trapping behind the live end.
Fair.
It's like and so like that concept is, I think, a little bit misleading and like trying to pare it down to a like home studio approach at least.
Gotcha. So then as far as paneling goes, obviously there's tons of options out there that are available. Any music store would typically has a bunch of stuff, and most of the time they have like the crappy foam stuff. But what options should people be looking for, and is the DIY route a good option to go?
Yeah. So if you have like the skill set and the time to make your own panels, it's very cost effective. I know, because that's how I got into this whole thing by accident. I was looking at products, and this was it's like 10 years ago. So there's definitely more options now. It's one of the reasons we are a company at all. There weren't a lot of affordable options at the time of products that like both worked well and looked good and didn't cost a fortune. But if you can make them, you'll save a ton of money. We've got a video, like a YouTube video that we did with Adam Audio that pretty much shows exactly how we make panels. So if people are interested, they can definitely check that out. And it's a great option to go because, ultimately the more you can treat your room, the better it's going to sound, and the more you can focus on music and being creative like we were talking about earlier. So that's an awesome option to go if you've got the skill set. If you don't, there are a lot of really great products out there. I think the stuff we make is obviously great. It's what I ended up using in my studios, and is stuff that we've kind of developed. And, at this stage, now that I've been doing it for a while, it's kind of everything, sort of the culmination of all of the things that I learned through my studios and through working on hundreds of different spaces And then there's several other companies out there as well. Like GIK makes great products. They do take a really long time to get, but they make solid stuff. Yesco from Acoustics Insider also has a course like on how to make really, really effective bass traps. So there's definitely good products out there and good resources now.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, for the most part, stay away from the foam stuff. And my first studio was all foam stuff that I had in there. I had no idea what I was doing at the time. It didn't sound very good, but you can go get it at the store, and it was the thing that I thought I should have in there. I would definitely stay away from that, and I would say make whatever you do put in your room, whether or not you buy it or you build it, make it as deep as you can.
Yeah. And what sort of material would someone need to build their own stuff?
For the most part, you just need our panels are built with a wood frame, and then we use mineral wool in them, which is pretty readily available. You can get rock wool, you can get it from Owens Corning, you can get 703, which is also very common. Those all are porous absorber type products, so velocity absorbers. You can use. I wouldn't use in a panel fluffy insulation, so like the normal pink stuff or white stuff now. It just, in that depth, doesn't work nearly as well. When you get to much greater depths of it, or combinations of things, it can be very effective. So somebody's trying to build their own 2-foot deep bass trap using combinations of fluffy and mineral wool or 703s, a very good way to go. But for just your panels, I'd stick to 703 or mineral wool. There's also some recycled denim products out there now, which are pretty cool. A little harder to get and much more expensive, but a cool way to go if you can.
Cool. And then the fabric on the outside of it is usually just something like speaker. I've seen people use speaker cloth. Is that a good option?
Yeah, I think speaker cloth. I've never used speaker cloth for it. I think it's probably a little on the light side, or at least what I think of as speaker cloth. But when I started making panels, I just went to the fabric store and bought fabric.
But the type of fabric you get is kind of important though, right? Because it can.
It is. You don't want it to be too. You just don't want it to be too thick, and you don't want. And I wouldn't use burlap because it's really loose. So the weave of the yarn in burlap is very open, and you obviously want something that's going to contain the panel so they're not super dusty and letting out any particles. We use Guilford of Maine fabric in all of our products. You can buy that directly from them. It's awesome fabric. The main thing, and it's all acoustically rated, so you can see exactly how transparent it is. You don't want to use something that's really thick because it will be reflective. You also, going to the fabric store will work and get you by, certainly, but it won't last that long. So over time, the fabric will kind of start to get a little bit wavy and the color will change if it's in the sun at all. So I would, if you're going to make them, it's worth it, I think, to spend a little bit extra money and get a nicer fabric, but you can use most things as long as they're not too heavy. It's you don't want a super dense fabric.
Yeah. And when you're putting the mineral wool or whatever it is that you're putting inside the panels, are you wrapping that at all? Is there any health concerns at all?
Definitely. When you're handling it, if you're cutting it, you're disturbing it and knocking those particles up, wear a mask. All the packaging should say that. Definitely follow those guidelines. Once it's in a panel, it's pretty, and it's stable and you're not agitating it, there's no issues there. They can be wrapped in a really, really thin layer of plastic. So painter's plastic that's 0.3 millimeters won't have any significant effect on how effective they are. So that can be a good way to go if somebody's concerned about it. But once you're done working with them, there's really no issue there.
That's good to know, for sure. And the last question I had for you, just about all this acoustic stuff, is what are your thoughts on using programs like SonarWorks or something like that, which are supposed to be room correction programs that pre-EQ your stuff? Is there a benefit to that? Is it actually good?
Yeah, for sure. I think SonarWorks is a really cool program. I wish personally that you had more control over it. I understand why we don't, but it would be awesome to, be able to have a little bit more control over what it's doing. Anything that you can do to make that room more accurate is going to be helpful. So yes, the short answer is, which I'm not very good at clearly, is yes, it is a good thing to use. I wouldn't recommend boosting anything with it. So there's a setting within SonarWorks where you can say max boost, And I think there's like 12 dB, 6 dB, or you can set it to 0 dB to where it's not actually boosting anything. I would definitely do that. And then the only correction it's going to make is cuts. And the main reason for that is anytime you're boosting something into your speakers, you're losing a ton of headroom. So you can no longer turn your speakers up as loud before they just start to distort. And within that, most things that you would try to be boosting are going to be cancellations from reflections off of a wall. And you can't EQ that, because the more you EQ into it, the cancellation, there's more energy hitting the wall and there's more energy coming back, and the cancellation's still the same. So you're not gaining anything by boosting those things, you're just losing headroom. But it's a great tool and it's very easy to use. It's relatively affordable and it will make your room a little bit flatter. It's not like a alternative to treating a space, because it doesn't have a really significant effect on the time domain of things. So like, do you have an even decay from your high frequencies, or an even decay time from your high frequencies to your low frequencies? It is a frequency response correction. It is not a time response correction by any means. And so that will all come down to like how well is the room treated and that kind of thing.
I'm glad you said that way, because I do think it's, often marketed as this way of getting, accurate listening, and there's more to it than just the EQ part of it.
Yeah. I would say the other side of this now is it's not totally there yet, but a lot of speaker manufacturers are coming out with more and more of their own DSP, and it isn't as necessarily it's not as intuitive as SonarWorks. Like SonarWorks is nice. It's like, here's the microphone, here's the software, they tell you where to put it, it makes a bunch of weird sounds, and it's like, boom, here you go. DSP within your speakers isn't nearly at that level of like usability and functionality, but it does let you EQ certain things. So if you have like a big boost, like we were talking about earlier with like your front to back room mode, because your speakers are all the way up against the wall, you can super easily EQ that out, smooth those things, and then leave everything else kind of be. And as soon as you'll find if you're EQing rooms, like you don't really want to do too much. But if you hit those big few areas where things just feel like they're a little bit out of balance, all of a sudden the room will sound incredible. So I'm definitely excited to see that come about more and more so like on the speaker side of things, for a couple of reasons. One, just how much control do we actually have over it? The lack of control in SonarWorks is fine, but not awesome, because I don't really want to be EQing things like above 1,000 hertz. Those are things that like are pretty easy to treat and are much better off just being treated, because anytime you EQ something, there's other effects from the EQ itself, and phase shifts and that kind of thing. So EQing lower frequencies and cutting out issues there is great. Higher up, definitely a lot less helpful and necessary. And then this was something that maybe I don't know if this is a common issue for most people. It drove me nuts that I couldn't listen to like a record player and also have that be corrected. So like if I'm going to correct my speakers, I want everything I hear out of them, regardless of like whether or not it's coming on my computer in Pro Tools or Spotify or on YouTube, like whatever it is, I want everything to be the same so that I'm never having to like compensate for it. And if you can do that at the speakers, it doesn't matter if you like plug a phone straight into them or your computer or a record player, it'll always be the same reference. I'm hopeful that like as things kind of continue to progress, there'll be more and more of that DSP functionality within speakers themselves, because that's really the best place for it.
Yeah, and it's also the best way to learn your room.
Yeah.
But like you have to listen to music on your monitors to understand what music should sound like in your room. When you're listening to mastered material, it's giving you an idea of like translatable music. So
exactly,
you want your music to sound like that. But if you don't have correction on one thing, but you have it on another, then you're kind of like guessing. Totally. Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, Graham, thank you for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. I love that we covered, pretty much everything from, what do you do if you don't have the budget to do anything or to pay for anything versus, doing it your own way or buying commercial stuff. I think we really covered a lot of the bases. And, I love that we focus so much on home studios, because everyone who's listening to this is working out of a home studio for the most part. Yeah. And anyone who isn't working out of a home studio is probably working in a place that was already designed so they don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think like, and I live in Nashville where there's a million studios, but it's like, we just did in the last week, like we worked on 2 different, like technically home studios, but they are houses that are like going to be commercial studios. So like very much so a home studio, same size, like control room as a normal living room. It normally is a living room, but that's like a completely functional commercial studio. And it's becoming more and more common now, which is very cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. For people who might want to find out more information about you and your products, what's the best place for them to go?
Definitely our website. It's just musiccityacoustics.com. All of the products are up there, obviously, but we've also got a ton of really cool resources just on acoustics and how to treat your home studio, what acoustic treatment products to put in there, and kind of the stages to treat it, like we were talking about today. And then we have a bunch of different videos in the works as well, and those will all be up there. Everything from like how to take measurements of your room to speaker placement and how to really figure out where the best listening position and speaker placement should go. We're going to get to like sub integration and whether or not you should use a sub, and if so, like where that should go and how to do that well, and a whole bunch of other ideas. So hopefully that should be out soon as well.
That's amazing. I'll definitely have show notes that'll have all the links to everything in there. Awesome. Graham, thank you for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. This was awesome. Thanks for having me.
So that was my interview with Graham Wax, and that was an amazing conversation. I love how much ground we covered there as far as treating your rooms and what things you need to pay attention to, because as we covered there are definitely things that are much more significant for making your room sound good than others. And I think that Graham gave a really good perspective on what's needed for a home studio versus what's needed for a much bigger facility. And based on the room that you're working out of, you're going to have to treat it differently. And I thought it was very interesting to get into the topic of diffusion. And I thought it was really interesting that Graham was saying that in home studios, it's not really a thing that people should be using. It can actually cause more problems than good. And it's interesting because that's such a topic that so many people discuss all the time when it comes to acoustic treatment. And we're often led to believe by manufacturers that we need to have all of these different tools, bass absorbers, diffusion, absorption, all this kind of stuff. We're led to believe that we need this stuff. But I love how Graham just simplified it and made it easy to identify whether you actually need this stuff or not. And for the majority of people listening to this podcast, I don't think you're going to need the diffusers based on his answer here. So I just thought it was a really great episode, tons of great information. So definitely make sure to go back to this one and start listening to it and make the adjustments that he suggested as far as some of the free things you can do. And then if you are feeling up to actually putting some treatment in your room, he gave us a lot of great tips there on how to do it yourself or what kind of products you should be looking out for. So definitely bookmark this episode because I'm sure you will want to go back to it. So I hope that you enjoyed that episode and found it just as informative as I did. And if you did enjoy it, definitely make sure to subscribe to this podcast. That way you don't miss out on more podcasts like this. And every Wednesday we have new episodes go live. And by being subscribed to the podcast, you'll be the first to be notified as episodes go live. So definitely make sure to do that. And check out MasterYourMix.com. That is where I help out musicians with their home studios. And I help them create pro-sounding recordings from their home studios with ease. And throughout the website, we've got lots of great resources designed to help make the process of music production very easy to understand. We cover everything from recording, editing, and mixing on the website. And one resource that you're definitely going to want to check out is called The Mixing Mindset. This is a book that I put out a few years ago that became an Amazon #1 bestseller. And inside of that book, I really break down the process of step-by-step mixing so that you know exactly what to do. You know what to listen out for, what tools to be using, when to be boosting and cutting, what frequencies to listen out for, and so much more so that you can actually create mixes from beginning to end and knowing when your mixes are done, which is also very important as well. So definitely check that out. It's called The Mixing Mindset, and that is available at MasterYourMix.com. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and that's it for this one. We'll talk to you soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@MasterYourMix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.